Hello, welcome back to Movie Husbands. Today we'll be reviewing His Three Daughters. Three distant sisters reunite in New York City to care for their sick father. Tensions rise as they confront past issues, aiming to heal family bonds amid laughter and tears. His Three Daughters is directed by Azazel Jacobs and stars Elizabeth Olsen, Carrie Coon, and Natasha Lyonne. So, Matt, what'd you think of His Three Daughters?
Oh man, what a endearing and very heavy film with so much to unpack here. His Three Daughters is an extremely heavy dialogue-driven film. The scenes take place almost entirely in this very small apartment, which are so rich with character development. As the film progresses, we learn so much about these three daughters and their relationships to their dad, but not only just that, their relationships to each other, which you had briefly mentioned in your opening of the synopsis of the film. So this film is filled with such immeasurably incredible performances by the wonderful Natasha Lyonne, Carrie Coon, and Elizabeth Olsen. And I think the film just so very realistically encapsulates what it means to lose a family member and what that experience is like, and how our understanding and perceptions of the person dying change as this process of grief is happening. And I found His Three Daughters to just be a very remarkable work filled with so much complexity and nuance of what it's like to be human during these very difficult times in life.
So this will be kind of an interesting review for me because although like some of our friends may know this, the vast majority of our viewers don't know that I lost my father this year. I don't intend on turning this review into like a personal weep fest, but that's really just to say that a lot of what I saw in this film were like direct things that I experienced earlier this year, which speaks to its realism. You know, when someone in your family dies, it triggers a lot of reflection. It triggers a lot of conversation with your family members where you take stock of your relationships and you look to the future and you look to one another. Oftentimes, it causes you to mend differences and see your family members in their most pure and well-intentioned ways or terms. You know, with death too, I mean, there's a lot that you need to do. You need to plan a service, write a eulogy. You need to call and inform people. You need to text people. And that division of labor can feel like a family coming together for the first time in a really long time. And another thing it can do is augment all of the differences that you have with one another and perhaps some disagreements, because everybody deals with death differently. And some people may get offended by the way that you deal with death. That didn't happen at all in my family, but that is a thing that can happen. Yeah. It certainly happens in this film. Anyhow, that's just my little preamble to say that I think this film is very good and very, very acute in its realism. It's written very realistically, but also confrontationally. It has about 100 minutes to explore like very, very heavy subject matter, and the character writing is just extraordinary all the way through. Like the film has a way of using your preconceived judgments of certain personality types against you. There are ways in which characters seem unflattering at first, only to be humanized later in the film, especially, you know, the second half, where you realize you, the viewer, were actually the one being too harsh and judgmental in the same ways that the characters were being too judgmental of one another. Beyond that, it's just a very heartfelt and emotional film. I mean, I was basically crying for the last half hour of this movie, and I was looking around the theater at like the other bros in black t-shirts to make sure they were crying too, and they all were. So shout out to those bros. But anyway, this is a movie that is just very, very emotional and very heartfelt. It's not a film that feels like a Lifetime movie where, you know, things like the violins start swelling and you can tell you're supposed to cry. It's a film that feels extremely natural in the ways that its emotionality comes about.
Yeah, that emotion is completely earned. And you were talking about these characters in the film, so I think that's a great place to diverge into a conversation about these actresses and the roles that they're playing. Mm-hmm. So one thing that you had just mentioned actually is how incredibly effective the film is at building these early perceptions of these characters and then forcing us as viewers to reassess those perceptions as the film progresses. To start, we have Natasha Lyonne, who plays Rachel, and Rachel at first comes across as this weed-addicted, lazy woman that spends her money betting on football games and completely shuns her responsibility of her father by mostly staying cooped up in her bedroom.
Yeah, she's like the up.
Yeah.
I know you have to bleep that, but you know, she's like the effed up child.
Yeah, and that's the way the movie is treating her. Then we have Elizabeth Olsen, who plays Christina in the film, and Christina at first comes across very self-absorbed. She talks about her kid almost entirely too much, and she can't help but talking about herself in nearly every single sentence. There's one sequence in particular where nearly every sentence starts with the word I. From there, lastly, we have Carrie Coon, who plays Katie, and she is the firstborn. She's clearly the most serious of all three of them. She is very type A. She hyper focuses on cleaning and making meals and writing the obituary and gets annoyed mostly with Rachel, who is not really taking care of her surroundings. Everything seems dirty and she's cleaning everything. And this is highlighted early in the film by her reaction to these expired apples that are in the fridge.
Yeah, completely. So Carrie Coon's character is this very universally uptight type A. I don't know if it explicitly says if she's the firstborn or not, but that like stereotype of a firstborn female is what she is to a T. Everything needs to be like a certain way, and responsibility is the be all end all. Like she's very inflexible, which I think clashes a lot with the other sisters. Elizabeth Olsen is a bit less controlled in that way, but still like she kind of has her life together in a certain way. And then Natasha Lyonne is completely living an alternative lifestyle, at least like the way that we see it at first.
Yeah, and as we were discussing how one of the best things about the film was the changing perceptions of these people, that we are forced to engage with these perceptions as the daughters are forced to engage with these perceptions. And this starts with a character named Benji, who is played by Jovan Adepo. A very small role in the film, but he basically comes over. He's Rachel's friend. They're hanging out in her bedroom, and he's the first to say, you know, you need to stick up for yourself. And you start talking about how much you were doing because you were living here. The other daughters weren't here, and you were the sole caretaker. From there, he has a scene where he brushes in with the other daughters and he makes a point to stick up for her himself. And he tells her all these things. And suddenly we find out the apples in the fridge aren't just expired apples that she was refusing to put away. They're apples that she was meticulously cutting up because it was the only thing that her dad would be willing to eat. These apples, they signify something larger, and a perception that was built just over them existing in the fridge by this other daughter is suddenly just so much more.
There's another example of that later in the film where we find out that she makes her money by sports betting. So she's watching games all day long, and the other sisters are judgmental about the fact that she's watching games. Like, oh, that's how she makes her living, by just betting on sports. And I think that's true to some degree. But we find out later in the film that the father was as involved and interested in the sports games as her, because she finally, towards the end of the film, goes to visit the father in the room and gives him an update on how all the various teams are doing. So clearly this is something that bonded the two of them, where you could see how this is something to feel judgmental about, but not so much once we know why she does it.
Yeah, and not just that, but the way that Benji is treated by the other daughters as if he never existed in this place, as if he's some kind of
outsider.
Kind of outsider. He has to tell them, like, I sat here on this couch with your dad and we watched game after game and we would just talk. And then we have Carrie Coon's character, that the meticulousness of her cleaning or cooking doesn't come from anywhere. It comes out of regret for her not being there, because she lives in the city. She's not so far away. The way which she avoided coming there and helping out is now a reflection of regret of not being there.
Yeah, the scene you were talking about with Benji is really the pivotal turning point of the film. That's when it goes from one type of drama to another, and then we start to realize that it's using our perceptions of these characters against us very acutely, very intelligently.
Yeah, there's a scene with Elizabeth Olsen character where she is suddenly taken by all this, like a panic attack, and she has to sit down, and everybody's coming up to her and just treating her as like nothing's going on, because they don't understand that her life is simply more complicated than she lets on. Her life is not perfect, and there's a whole conversation around that, which is actually a very beautiful scene where all the three daughters finally sit together, and there's some tense moments in this conversation, but there's an opening up of their personalities and why these perceptions were built in the first place.
Okay, so from here, we're going to go into a more spoiler-filled conversation. So if you haven't seen the film, I would encourage you to perhaps come back if you don't want to have the film spoiled for you, but we're going to talk about the last like 15 or 20 minutes of it. At the end of the film, we see this fantasy sequence of the father speaking to his three daughters. Like, he tells them things he appreciates about all three of them. He monologues about his regrets and his wishes for them after he's gone. It's an extraordinarily touching scene that is then undercut by the sudden sadness of realizing that it's a vision, if it's able to trick you. I think you said you were kind of, you knew that this was a fantasy.
Well, so what I find interesting about the scene is it starts off with reality and it blends itself into fantasy, and you don't realize it's fantasy, or some people can pick up on when that transition to fantasy happens based upon certain elements in the scenes. But from here at the beginning, you know, he has this burst of energy and he wants to come out of his room. The daughters wheel him out of his room. He starts mumbling a little bit. They sit him into his chair. And then from here, he proceeds to rip off the IV from his arm. He gets up out of his chair with all this energy and he starts talking to them. And as you were saying, he's talking about all his wishes for them. He's talking about this woman that he loved. It was somebody who he had come across in life, and that person had such a big impact on his life, and he never got to tell them about her. So he's just saying the simple story about this woman he had met in the past. That's when we hear the beeps of the machine turn into this long droning beep of the flatline. Suddenly, we are met with this quick cut from him looking in the direction of the chair and seeing him there passed away. It's a very heartwarming scene because of what it gives. It gives the daughters a little bit of closure because it's all the things you wish you would hear from a loved one before they passed away. It gives his character a little bit of closure because he gets to express something about his life that he never got to. Yes, we see that and it's endearing, but it's also very sad because there's things that you didn't get to say.
Yeah, I can understand how this may have been jarring to some viewers, or maybe like the sudden change in perspective to the father is off-putting to some, but this final statement where we get this perspective from the dead, I thought was really extraordinary. Just as death brings about reflection on the part of the grieving folks, it also brings about reflection on the part of the dying, I'm sure.
Yeah.
So he has these final explanations of his wishes, but he never truly gets to say them. It's heartbreaking, but it's a very universal sentiment.
Definitely. There's a earlier scene which Elizabeth Olsen's character had a conversation with him in the past about death. It's this very poignant moment, and the other daughters want to know what it is he thought about death, and he talked about those perceptions being built in their absence. It was a very poignant moment. She said it much better than I'm saying it now, but it was very beautiful, very touching. I think we were both crying at that moment. From there, I do want to talk just briefly about the conscious decision this film had to not show the dad or enter his room the entirety of the movie.
Yeah.
I really, really, really liked this choice because A, I loved how, in a way, it was respecting his privacy and space during his process of dying. And B, I think the film didn't want us to remember him by his current state, but as he was when he was living. And I think that's a portion of what that final scene is meant to do. It's supposed to show us what he was like when he was living, not how he is in this moment of his life.
Yeah, I like that too, just for on a script level, like it's a good amount of dramatic tension in terms of who's going to go into the room and when. The other thing too is it gives the actor who plays the father one really pivotal scene, which I like that there's only one scene with the father and it's so over the top and it's so extraordinary in what he has to say.
So you ready to go grades?
Yes, I'm going to give this film an A-. I thought it was certainly one of my favorite movies this year. We didn't talk like a ton about the acting, but this film is very, very well acted. All of these characters, not only are they written so well and so finely drawn from a script perspective, but they're just wonderfully acted by three tremendous actresses that I don't even think that I could pick a favorite. I would love for all three of them to be nominated at the Oscars, which I'm sure won't happen.
But they're Oscar worthy as well.
Oscar worthy, yeah, completely. I think we mentioned it, but the film mostly takes place in one apartment, so it's a chamber piece. So the idea of keeping one apartment visually interesting, I think it did a very good job of that. So I mentioned how this film was personal to me in some way, and I think that when something happens in your life, you may watch films to escape things, or you may watch films to confront things. And if you're the type of person that likes to watch films to confront things, this is certainly a film to watch. I'm more the latter category. I'm a confrontational film watcher, so I felt very healed by this film. I felt very understood by it, and that's, immeasurable. That's a beautiful thing.
I couldn't agree more. That was very wonderfully put. It's a very beautiful film. It's very sad, but it's filled with so much of the complexities of what it's like to lose somebody. And I really love the direction that Azazel Jacobs put into all these performances here, because this wouldn't happen without her direction and crafting these characters and how they operate with each other. There was so much detail packed into this film where all the details matter and they reflect on the characters. It's one of the things I love absolutely most about it. But with that said, I give this movie an A. I really love this film and I thought it did a wonderful job building these characters and displaying such an accurate portrait of death and grief. I think death is obviously tragic, no doubt, but in the experience of losing someone, there is such a whirlwind of emotions in this reflection. There's sadness and pain, yes, but there's also the responsibility that comes along with getting one's affairs in order. There's also the occasional laughs about silly things the person would say or do. Grief is never just this one thing. And I love that the way this film accurately and differently from a lot of the ways other films portray death depicted all the feelings that we experience when losing somebody.
And that's it for a review of His Three Daughters, which is out in cinemas now and will be on Netflix on September 20th. So definitely check it out. What did you think of the film? Let us know below and we will see you next time.